Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most quietly demanding futures ever imagined by our species. For decades, we've pictured what life on Mars might look like. Cities beneath transparent domes, greenhouses stretching across the red landscape, the first children born on another world. What was once science fiction is now being discussed as a serious goal for the end of this decade and into the 2030s. It's an inspiring vision, but it leaves out almost everything that actually matters. Because Mars isn't simply another planet waiting for people to arrive. It's an environment where nearly every condition required for human life is missing. The atmosphere is less than 1% as dense as Earth's. The air is almost entirely carbon dioxide. Step outside without protection, and you'd lose consciousness in seconds. Soon after, your body would begin to fail in ways that seem almost impossible to imagine. And that's only the first problem. The real danger isn't any single threat. It's what happens when every threat arrives at once, every hour of every day, with almost no margin for error. By the end of tonight, you'll understand why living on Mars is less like settling a new frontier, and more like surviving inside a machine that can never be allowed to fail. Why the planet challenges almost every system the human body depends on, and why, even knowing all of this, people would still choose to go. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. That image has stayed with us for decades. Domes rising from the rust-colored plains, catching the pale light of a sun that looks wrong, too small, too distant. Greenhouses stretching row after row, with plants green enough to feel like a promise. Astronauts in sleek suits, walking the open surface as if Mars were simply the next place we decided to be. That image is in every announcement, every artist's rendering, every documentary segment that ends with humanity as a multiplanetary species. It is a compelling image, and it is, in almost every important way, incomplete. The assumption underneath it goes something like this. Getting there is the hard part. The rockets, the trajectory, the 7 months of deep space travel, the terrifying descent through a thin atmosphere onto an alien surface. Once you solve those problems, survival is just a matter of good engineering and enough supplies. Pack the right equipment, build the right habitat, solve the logistics. The rest follows. That assumption is wrong, not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. Mars does not offer one dramatic danger to prepare for and move past. It offers dozens of them, all at once, all the time, with no exit available. Not a single threat you train for and then face. A permanent accumulation of threats you carry every moment of every day with no way to step outside them. That is what the concept art leaves out. That is what most mission announcements do not say plainly. And that is what this exploration is about. But before examining those dangers, it is worth saying clearly what is real and what is working. The engineering of getting to Mars is genuinely, impressively real. We are not talking about paper proposals or science fiction timelines. Private companies have built rockets of a scale that would have seemed absurd a decade ago. Massive reusable vehicles capable of carrying dozens of people on a single flight. Tested in real conditions with real hardware that grows more capable with each attempt. Space agencies are advancing plans that treat Mars not as a distant dream, but as an operational target, with the moon serving as a staging ground, and lessons learned there applied to the longer journey. Some timelines suggest a first crewed landing before this decade ends. Others target the 2030s, treating a sustained lunar presence as the necessary first step. Planners disagree on timing. They do not disagree on the destination. This is a genuine achievement. The gulf between the state of human spaceflight 20 years ago and the state of it today is not a small gap. The rockets that exist now, the life support technologies being developed, the trajectory planning that has grown more precise with each unmanned mission to the Martian surface, these are the results of enormous sustained effort by thousands of engineers and scientists. This essay does not argue that Mars is unreachable. It does not argue the missions are not worth attempting. Both of those arguments would be wrong. What it argues is simpler and harder to hear. The engineering of reaching Mars is, in the broad sweep of the problem, the tractable part. The funding exists. The hardware is advancing. The physics is understood well enough to plan around. Humans will almost certainly land on Mars. The question this video is asking is different. What happens to them after the rocket touches down? What does the rest of their time there actually look like? day by day, week by week, year by year. Here is what no mission announcement tends to say plainly. The people who go will live somewhere that does not forgive a single careless mistake. Not for a week, not for a month, for years. There is no evacuation window that opens on demand. There is no medical facility a flight away. There is no moment when they can step outside and simply breathe. Every hour they spend on Mars will be an hour spent managing a habitat that must not fail, a suit that must not fail, a food supply that must not fail, a body that is slowly being asked to do something it was not built to do. Not once, continuously. The gap between the popular image and that reality is the subject of everything that follows. Domes and greenhouses and the feeling of open frontier versus the cramped, monitored, repair-saturated life that surviving on Mars would actually require. The concept art version is not a lie, exactly. It is a selection. It shows the best case, the destination after all the problems are solved, the moment when everything has worked. What it does not show is the daily weight of keeping everything working in a place where the environment is trying, in a dozen separate ways simultaneously, to kill you. Getting to Mars is the beginning of the story, not the climax. Arrival is comparatively tractable. The unglamorous, relentless, genuinely difficult part is everything that comes after the rocket lands. And we have not yet begun to account for all of it. Let's start with the very first thing that would try to kill you. Not the cold, not a dust storm, not a micrometeorite. The air. Mars has an atmosphere. That much is technically true, but the surface pressure sits below 1% of what you breathe on Earth. The air outside is almost entirely carbon dioxide, with barely a trace of oxygen. Standing on the Martian surface without protection is not like standing at the top of a very tall mountain, struggling to catch your breath. It is something else entirely. Here is where most people's intuitions fail them. The imagined death on Mars is freezing or suffocating, slowly, the way it sounds in the movies. The real mechanism is stranger and faster than that. At pressures below a certain threshold, water does not need heat to boil. It only needs the absence of pressure that normally keeps it liquid. On the surface of Mars, that threshold is crossed without question. The water in your blood and saliva begins to vaporize at ordinary body temperature, not from heat, from lack of pressure. Doctors call this ebullism. Saliva bubbles on your tongue. Moisture on the surface of your eyes vaporizes. The same happens in the lining of your lungs. Your tissues begin to swell as dissolved gases come out of solution in your blood. Oxygen loss drives unconsciousness in roughly 15 seconds. Without help, death follows within 1 to 2 minutes. Not slowly, not dramatically. Quickly, quietly, and at normal body temperature. This is not an occasional hazard. It is not like lightning, which requires the right storm conditions or riptides, which require the right coastline. Mars has no other mode. The moment you step outside without protection, that process begins. Every second of every day, on every part of the planet's surface, the air is trying to begin that process. The entire environment is permanently, uniformly lethal to unprotected human tissue. That fact shapes everything else. It means colonists cannot live without a barrier between themselves and the outside atmosphere. And the simplest, most reliable form of that barrier is a suit. But here is where it gets strange, because the suit that keeps you alive is also the suit you have to wear through a working day. The suits most people picture come from Apollo and the International Space Station. They work by surrounding the body with pressurized gas, a bubble of breathable atmosphere contained inside a sealed shell. That design is reliable. Decades of engineering have refined it. But it is also stiff, bulky, and physically exhausting to wear for hours at a time. Every bend of your knee, every curl of your fingers, every turn of your wrist fights against the internal pressure trying to keep the suit rigid. Apollo astronauts wore them for brief surface excursions. ISS spacewalks are carefully choreographed and counted in hours. A Mars colonist digging soil samples, climbing a slope, operating equipment, fixing a conduit, loading cargo would be wearing that resistance all day, across thousands of working days. A different approach exists. Mechanical counter-pressure suits apply pressure not through gas, but through the suit itself. Tight woven fabric pressed directly against the skin across the entire body, replacing the pressurized bubble with direct mechanical force. The idea is compelling. A suit that fits like a second skin would allow far more natural movement, far less fatigue, far more freedom during the kind of repetitive physical labor a Mars colony demands. But these suits remain largely experimental. Consistent pressure across a moving human body is hard to engineer. Joints flex. The torso expands and contracts with every breath. The pressure that is adequate at one moment becomes inadequate at another, and any gap in coverage is a problem. The engineering of mechanical counterpressure suits is not solved. It is being worked on. The honest answer is that colonists might wear one kind of suit or the other, or some hybrid that does not yet exist. But whichever it is, they will wear it constantly. And small flaws compound. A seam that rubs slightly on hour 1 becomes a serious skin lesion on hour 3000. A joint that resists just a little generates cumulative muscle fatigue over weeks. The suit is not a piece of emergency equipment stored in a cabinet. It is daily wear, as familiar and as present as clothing, and imperfect in ways that accumulate. But the suit is only the second barrier. The habitat is the first. Every colonist lives inside a pressurized structure that is itself holding the outside environment at bay. When they step outside, they move from the first barrier to the second. Every hatch, every airlock seal, every glove coupling, every valve, every gasket on every hose in every system is a third barrier. A small engineered boundary standing between breathable air and instant catastrophe. On Earth, a broken window is an inconvenience. You find a board, you call someone, you feel a draft. On Mars, a broken seal is a seconds measured emergency. Pressure drops. You do not have time to call someone. You act immediately with what you have in your hands. Think about what that means lived over time. Every door a colonist passes through requires checking. Every seal before an EVA, a surface excursion, gets inspected. A pinhole leak in a glove is a real emergency patched with bare, shaking hands under time pressure. The submarine analogy gets close. Crews on submarines operate in a hostile medium that would kill them instantly if the hull failed. And the psychological weight of that is documented and real. Antarctic research teams face something similar. An environment so hostile that going outside without proper preparation means death, with no immediate rescue available. But submarines can surface. Antarctic bases can, in principle, call in an aircraft in a genuine emergency. Mars offers neither exit. You are in the hostile environment. You stay in it. There is no surfacing. There is no plane. The result is a form of psychological burden that has no precise parallel in most human lives. Chronic background vigilance, checking seals before meals, checking seals before sleep cycles, never entirely relaxing because the thing that would kill you is not far away, not occasional, not weather dependent. It is outside every wall, every moment. The first colonists would live inside that awareness the way people on Earth live inside weather. Except, weather has windows of genuine safety, and Mars does not. The air was just the beginning. What comes next compounds it. The air at least announces itself. You can watch a pressure gauge drop. You can feel a seal that has gone wrong through the drop in breathable mix. The next hazard gives you nothing. No gauge you can glance at in the moment. No physical sensation as it works. No warning before the damage is done. That hazard is radiation. On Earth, we don't think about it. We don't need to. The planet provides 2 layers of protection so reliable that we have never had to build our own. The first is the atmosphere itself. That thick column of air above your head absorbs and scatters most of the radiation streaming in from the sun and from deep space. The second is Earth's magnetic field, generated by the churning molten iron in the planet's core. That field deflects high-energy charged particles before they ever reach the atmosphere. Between those 2 shields, almost none of the radiation that originates in space arrives at ground level in any significant quantity. You walk through your entire life inside those protections and never feel them working. Mars has neither. Billions of years ago, Mars had a magnetic field. The core was hot enough and active enough to sustain one. But then the core cooled. The dynamo shut down. The magnetic field collapsed. And once it was gone, the solar wind, the constant stream of charged particles pouring outward from the sun, had nothing to deflect it. Over eons, that wind stripped the Martian atmosphere away, molecule by molecule, into space. This is not an independent problem from the one covered in the previous section. It is the same problem seen from another angle. The same lost field that leaves the surface exposed to radiation is the reason the air is so thin today. One dead core created two lethal conditions. The result is a surface bathed in radiation that would constitute a serious occupational hazard anywhere on Earth. We have measurements. The Curiosity rover carries a radiation detector, and the data it has returned is specific. A person living on the surface of Mars for 1 year would absorb roughly 200 to 300 millisieverts of radiation from background sources alone. A person living on Earth for the same year absorbs about 2 to 3 millisieverts from natural background. That is not a modest difference. That is not a factor of 2 or 3. It is on the order of 100 times Earth's background dose. In a single year. Over several years, which is the minimum any realistic settlement scenario would involve, the cumulative dose enters territory associated with a measurably increased lifetime risk of cancer. It also raises a second concern that some studies suggest, but that science has not yet fully resolved: the possibility that long-term, high-dose exposure to the kinds of radiation found in deep space and on the Martian surface could cause damage to the central nervous system, potentially affecting cognition over time. That finding is not established fact. It is an open question, and an uncomfortable one. But it is a question that any serious discussion of long-duration Mars habitation has to hold. And that is only the background dose. It excludes what happens when the sun flares. Solar particle events are sudden, intense bursts of high-energy particles thrown outward by solar flares. On Earth, our magnetic field absorbs most of the impact. On Mars, there is no such buffer. A significant solar particle event can spike radiation levels at the Martian surface to acutely dangerous levels within a matter of hours. Not over years, hours. On Earth, if a major event were predicted, you would go indoors. The building itself would provide meaningful shielding. On Mars, anyone caught away from heavily shielded shelter during a bad event could absorb a dangerous acute dose before they could do much about it. The background is a slow accumulation. A solar particle event is a sudden spike on top of it. Both are problems. Together, they make the surface a place where every hour outside carries a cost. Here is where the popular image breaks down completely. When people imagine a Mars colony, they picture glass domes, wide curved panels looking out at rust-colored mountains and a dim salmon sky, communal spaces with transparent ceilings and views across the terrain. That image is in concept art. It is in films. It is in the earliest architectural proposals that circulated when Mars colonization first became a serious conversation. It feels like the natural destination, a place where humans have claimed enough of an alien world to build something beautiful in it. Glass does not stop radiation. Thin metal does not stop radiation. Every transparent panel in those domes would be a gap in the shielding. Every window large enough to give a view would be large enough to let in everything the surface sends. Serious habitat proposals do not look like that. They bury structures under several feet of Martian regolith, the loose rock and soil that covers the surface, which provides meaningful mass shielding. They propose building inside natural lava tubes, underground channels carved by ancient volcanic activity, where meters of rock overhead provide protection. Some designs wrap living quarters in thick water tanks, using water's hydrogen content to absorb incoming particles. The designs share a logic. Put mass between the inhabitants and the sky. As much mass as possible, as completely as possible. The realistic vision is not a domed city. It is closer to a bunker. Tunnels, buried modules, artificial lighting that cycles to simulate day, because the natural light above is not safe to live under without shielding. Thick walls, small, reinforced viewing ports rather than panoramic windows. Every square foot of transparent surface is a square foot of inadequate shielding, so viewing ports are minimal. The trade-off is not aesthetic. It is biological survival. Think about what that means for the people who chose to go. Many of them would have spent years imagining mornings on Mars, a slow walk across terrain no human had touched before. The silence, the scale, the alien sky. They would arrive and discover that those walks exist, but in limited windows, inside a suit, with a personal radiation dosimeter clipped to the chest, tracking their accumulated dose the way an office worker wears an ID badge. Not as a dramatic reminder of risk, as routine, as the ordinary daily fact of where they are. And then they would return underground, back to the tunnels, back to the artificial light. The Red Mountain view they had imagined was real, but accessible only in careful portions, monitored and rationed because the light that illuminates those mountains carries something the atmosphere no longer filters, and the absent magnetic field no longer stops. Radiation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like anything as it accumulates. That is what makes it, in some ways, the more insidious of the two foundational hazards. The atmosphere problem, at least, is immediate and obvious. The radiation problem is quiet. It is patient. It works in the background whether or not anyone is paying attention to it. And both of these hazards exist before the first colonist has tried to eat, to stay warm, or to remain sane in a place where home is permanently out of reach. Not every threat on Mars is invisible. Not every killer is silent. Some of the things that would wear a colony down are not exotic at all. Some of them sound almost boring, cold, dust, and that ordinariness is exactly what makes them dangerous to underestimate. Temperature on the surface sounds like the easy part. Mars is cold, yes, but people survive cold climates on Earth. Expeditions have crossed Antarctica. Researchers have wintered at the poles. Surely the thinking goes, cold is a solved problem. Insulate the habitat. Dress the colonists properly. Move on to the harder challenges. But here is where that thinking breaks down. The average surface temperature on Mars is around -80 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly -62 degrees Celsius. That alone is brutal. Most places on Earth never approach it. But the average is not the problem. The swing is the problem. A single Martian day can shift more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, more than 56 degrees Celsius, between the warmest afternoon hours and the coldest stretch before dawn. Earth's most extreme deserts, the Sahara, the Atacama, rarely swing more than 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit in a day, around 28 to 33 degrees Celsius, and they are considered exceptional, punishing environments for that reason. Mars does nearly double that, every day. The reason is the atmosphere. Earth's air, even in a desert, acts like a blanket. It holds the day's warmth into the night, slowing the loss. Mars has almost no atmosphere to hold anything. When the sun sets, heat bleeds away from the surface almost immediately, with almost nothing to slow it. Temperatures that briefly approach the freezing point of water on a summer afternoon near the equator can crash toward -130 degrees Fahrenheit within hours. Think about what that means for the machinery. Batteries lose capacity faster in cold, metal becomes brittle under repeated thermal stress. Seals, the gaskets and rings that keep pressurized volumes separate from the Martian surface, expand and contract every single day as temperatures rise and fall. They were designed to do this a limited number of times. Over months and years, each cycle shortens their functional life. A seal that would last a decade on Earth might fail far sooner under daily thermal cycling this severe. Every hatch, every airlock, every joint in the habitat is doing this cycling continuously, for the entire duration of the colony's existence. And then, there is the heating burden itself. Every Martian night, the habitat must be heated against temperatures that would kill a person in minutes without protection. Not occasionally, every night, for years. Heating ranks alongside oxygen production and water reclamation as one of the largest, most relentless energy demands a Mars colony would carry. It cannot be paused. It cannot be reduced much without endangering the people inside. It just runs, night after night, draining the power budget in the dark. Now consider dust. Dust sounds almost quaint after radiation, after ebullism, after the prospect of a failed seal. Dust sounds like something you sweep up. A nuisance. A cosmetic problem. It is not. Martian dust is nothing like the sand at a beach or the grit in a desert on Earth. Earth has had liquid water flowing across its surface for billions of years. That water tumbles particles against each other, wearing down sharp edges, rounding them, polishing them over time. Martian dust has never had that treatment. Its particles are extremely fine, almost a powder, and they are sharp-edged and jagged at the microscopic level because nothing has ever smoothed them. Running that material through a human lung is not like breathing beach air. It is closer to breathing tiny glass shards. That alone would be serious. But Martian dust carries something else. It is loaded with reactive compounds called perchlorates, chemical salts that are toxic to the human thyroid gland and able to disrupt iodine metabolism if they enter the body in sufficient quantities through inhalation or ingestion. Perchlorates are not uniformly dangerous at trace exposure, but they are not inert. For colonists spending years on Mars, chronic low-level perchlorate exposure, inhaled with every breath of recycled air that carries even a small amount of contamination, is a genuine, long-term health concern. And contamination is effectively inevitable. Every time a colonist returns from an excursion, dust comes with them. Through the airlock, despite the best procedures, despite brushing and vacuuming and pressure cycling, fine particles ride back inside. Think of beach sand that always ends up in a car, no matter how carefully you tried to leave it at the waterline. Martian dust is finer, lighter, and electrostatically charged. It clings. It clings to suit fabric, to equipment surfaces, to airlock interiors, to solar panel glass. It finds its way into ventilation filters, into the gaps in machinery, into the lungs of people breathing recycled air that never completely escapes contamination. The long-term respiratory risk resembles silicosis, the disease that has killed miners on Earth for centuries. Inhaled fine particles, jagged and insoluble, lodge in lung tissue and cause scarring over time. Mars colonists would not face a single catastrophic dust event. They would face a chronic, quiet, cumulative assault on their airways measured over years. Managing dust is not a problem that gets solved and set aside. It is a problem that is managed, imperfectly, every day, for as long as the colony exists. It is not the work of exploration. It is closer to fighting mold in a damp basement. Necessary, exhausting, unglamorous, and permanent. But here is where the dust problem reaches its most acute form. Mars generates regional dust storms regularly. Most are local, or at most continental in scale. But roughly once every few Martian years, and a Martian year is nearly 2 Earth years, a storm grows large enough to encircle the entire planet. These planet-encircling storms can last for weeks to months, and during their peak they darken the sky dramatically, even at midday. Not a cloudy day, not a haze, a sustained orange twilight that blocks a significant fraction of available sunlight across the whole surface. In 2018, one of these storms arrived with exceptional intensity. It ended NASA's Opportunity rover mission. Opportunity had operated on the Martian surface for nearly 15 years, powered by solar panels. When the 2018 storm descended, it blocked enough sunlight that the rover's panels could no longer generate sufficient power. The batteries drained. The rover fell silent. Mission controllers attempted contact for months. Opportunity never responded. The storm had not damaged the hardware directly. It had simply cut off the power supply, and the cold did the rest. For a rover, that outcome is a loss. For a human colony partially dependent on solar power, the same scenario is something else entirely. A weeks-long storm cutting solar output to a fraction of normal would threaten the power grid running the oxygen generators, the heaters, the water reclamation systems, the very systems that cannot be allowed to fail. This is why real designs for permanent Mars colonies lean heavily toward nuclear power. Not as a secondary option, as the primary foundation. Because the sun cannot be trusted on Mars. It can be blocked for weeks, without warning, at planetary scale. Any colony that depends on sunlight for survival is a colony that a dust storm can kill. The colonists would plan their operational life around it. They would know these storms come. They would stockpile. They would run drills. They would limit excursions during peak storm periods, not only because the reduced visibility makes travel dangerous, but because every hour spent outside in a dust-charged atmosphere is another hour of exposure to charged perchlorate particles that find every gap in a suit's filtration. An orange, dust-choked Martian twilight lasting for 2 months is not a weather event to wait out with hot drinks by a window. It is a siege, and enduring it is the ordinary, unromantic work of staying alive on a planet that does not care whether anyone does. Cold and dust would not be the threats that inspired people to leave Earth. They would be the threats that ground them down in the years after they arrived. And they would still be there the next morning, and the morning after that, waiting to be managed again. The more dramatic hazards were the ones that could kill quickly. These were the ones that could simply exhaust everything first. Suppose every external hazard were solved. Suppose the habitat held its pressure perfectly. The shielding buried the radiation. The nuclear reactor hummed through every dust storm, and the seals never failed. Suppose all of it worked exactly as designed. There would still be one thing no wall could fix. One thing no engineering solution addresses. The planet's gravity itself, quietly, continuously, rewriting every body inside those walls. Mars pulls at about 38% of what Earth does. That number sounds manageable. It sounds like a gentler version of something we already understand. Not weightlessness, but not full weight either. Somewhere in between. That framing is almost exactly right, and it is almost exactly misleading, because we have decades of data on what zero gravity does to the human body, and we have essentially no data on what partial gravity does over years. That distinction is not a footnote. It sits at the center of the entire colonization project. Start with what we know. Astronauts living aboard the International Space Station in effective microgravity lose bone density at roughly 1 to 1.5% per month. That loss is concentrated in the weight-bearing bones, the hips and the lower spine, the structures that spend a lifetime pushing against Earth's pull and weaken when that pull disappears. Muscles atrophy despite rigorous daily exercise, because exercise in orbit can partially compensate, but cannot fully replace the constant low-level loading that gravity provides every waking minute on Earth. The heart, which evolved to pump blood upward against gravity, gradually weakens and changes shape, becoming more spherical, less efficient. Fluids shift toward the head, raising pressure behind the eyes, altering the shape of the eye itself, and causing vision changes that in some astronauts have not fully reversed years after returning to Earth. This condition now has a formal name: spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. The immune system becomes measurably less effective. Kidney stones become more likely, because the calcium released from weakening bones alters how the body processes minerals. Every one of these effects is well documented, and every one of them comes from zero gravity, not from partial gravity. This matters enormously, because 38% is not zero, but how close to zero it behaves, biologically over years and decades, is a question science cannot currently answer. The answer was stranger than expected. The strongest long-duration human data we have comes from a study that was also, inadvertently, one of the most elegant experiments in the history of medicine. Astronaut Scott Kelly spent nearly a year aboard the International Space Station. His identical twin brother Mark stayed on Earth. Because they share essentially the same genome, any biological difference that emerged between them over those months could be attributed, with unusual confidence, to the experience of spaceflight itself. What the researchers found was not subtle. Scott's gene expression changed in measurable ways. His immune system behaved differently. His telomeres, the protective structures capping the ends of his chromosomes, actually grew longer in space, which surprised nearly everyone, and then collapsed rapidly within days of his return to Earth. His vision showed changes consistent with the fluid shift problems already noted, and some of those changes persisted for years after he came home. 1 year. In microgravity, that is the strongest data point we have. A Mars colonist would spend not 1 year, but potentially 10, 20, or more years under partial gravity. Not zero gravity, not Earth gravity. A gravity level no human being has ever lived under for longer than the brief hours of an Apollo mission. Scientists have no model for what that does. They have informed guesses. They have extrapolations from the zero gravity data. But they do not have data. Every colonist who goes would become that data. Not metaphorically, literally. Each one would be a long-term medical case study, contributing the measurements that future colonists would depend on, while facing incomplete information about what was happening inside their own body 10 or 20 years in. Think about what that means. Lived from the inside. Not a known risk with a known curve. An unknown risk with no curve yet. Only a direction. The return question makes this even starker. Imagine a colonist who has lived on Mars for 10 years. Set aside, for a moment, whether the journey back is physically possible at that point in the mission. Think only about what happens to the body when it reaches Earth. Bones that have spent a decade adapting to 38% gravity, whatever that adaptation looks like, would now need to bear full Earth weight again. A cardiovascular system that reorganized itself around a weaker gravitational load would need to regulate blood pressure against a much stronger one. Fractures become a real possibility. Fainting from blood pressure that cannot adjust fast enough becomes a real possibility. The reconditioning required would be gradual, careful, medically supervised, and uncertain in its outcome. Return, even if logistically achievable, is not a simple homecoming. It is a second physiological renegotiation, this one in the wrong direction, with a body that has been changed by a decade of conditions we cannot yet fully model. There is a smaller version of this problem that shows up in the very first weeks. Objects on Mars fall more slowly than on Earth. A drop tool takes longer to reach the floor. A poured liquid arcs differently. A step forward carries farther than expected. Because the muscles fire with Earth-calibrated force and the planet pushes back with only 38% of the expected resistance. The early Apollo astronauts experienced something similar on the Moon, where gravity is even weaker, and the footage shows it plainly. They stumble, they overshoot, they adjust, gradually over the first hours and days, developing new movement patterns tuned to the weaker pull. Mars colonists would go through the same recalibration, over weeks, and then, if they stayed long enough, they would not be recalibrating anymore. Mars gravity would become their baseline. Earth gravity, experienced years or decades later, would feel oppressive, exhausting, disorienting. Every motion would cost more. Every step would land harder than the nervous system expected. The body that arrived on Mars as an Earth-adapted organism would have become, quietly and incrementally, something else. We do not have a clean analogy for this. The zero-gravity effects are documented, but 38% is not zero. It is something in between, in a space where the data simply does not exist yet. A body slowly reshaped by weaker gravity is a body entering unmapped territory. Not dramatically, not suddenly. 1 month at a time, 1 percentage point of bone density at a time, 1 small recalibration of the cardiovascular system at a time. The cumulative portrait, a decade out, remains one of the most important unknowns in human space medicine. And the gravity would not be the last invisible pressure working on the people inside those habitats. If a grown body changes this much under 38% gravity, consider one that never knew anything else. Children have always been part of the serious conversation about Mars colonization, not as a distant abstraction, but as a practical necessity. A self-sustaining settlement, one that does not depend on a steady supply of people from Earth to function, eventually requires people born there, children raised there, generations that do not remember Earth, except as a distant point of light in the Martian sky. Nobody knows what growing up under 38% gravity would do to a human body. That is not a hedge. That is the honest state of the science. Bone growth, muscle development, cardiovascular formation, the inner ear's calibration for balance, all of these processes in a developing child are shaped by Earth's constant gravitational pull. Evolution built the blueprint on a planet with a specific gravity. Every system in a child's body forms under that assumption. Remove it or reduce it dramatically, and what you get is genuinely unknown. But there are things we can reasonably expect. Under less compressive force, bones may grow differently. A child on Mars might grow taller, the spine less compressed during those years of vertical growth. But taller does not mean stronger. The same reduced load that relieves compression might also mean bones that never built the density that Earth gravity demands. Muscles that develop under lighter conditions may never grow the mass needed to move a full-weight body. The cardiovascular system, never asked to push blood against the full pull of Earth, might develop into something that works beautifully on Mars and struggles catastrophically anywhere else. That last part is the strange one. A child born on Mars, raised on Mars, might never be able to safely visit Earth. Not as a hardship, not as a political condition, simply as a fact of biology. Their body would be built for the world they came from. Earth's gravity, 38% heavier than everything their physiology ever trained against, might be more than their bones could bear, more than their heart could sustain. They would be Martians, not by choice or declaration, by formation. And here is where the romantic image quietly inverts itself. Most people imagine the first Martians as the brave volunteers, the original crew who landed and endured, the ones who made it possible. But the first truly permanent Martians, the first humans physiologically adapted to live there and unable to leave, might not be those pioneers at all. It might be their children, their grandchildren, the ones who never had to adapt because they never needed to. Mars would sculpt them slowly, through nothing more deliberate than gravity doing what gravity does, and they would emerge as something that shares our biology at the level of DNA, but diverges from us in every physical dimension that matters. Not a different species, not science fiction, a different branch of the same tree, shaped by a different world. We should hold this carefully, because the unknowns here are genuine. The effects of 38% gravity on fetal development during pregnancy, on an infant's first years, On a teenager's growing skeleton, these are questions no study has answered. No animal experiment has modeled them at this scale or duration. This is not a known risk with a known curve. It is unmapped in the most literal sense. But the population question has a different character. It is colder, more structural, and in some ways more immediately limiting. Population biologists have raised a concern that applies to any small founding colony that might ever be isolated from Earth. Small populations lose genetic diversity over generations. This is not a theory. It is a documented pattern in any isolated community, human or animal, that breeds within a limited gene pool over time. Harmful recessive traits, the kind that only express when a child inherits the same faulty gene from both parents, appear more frequently when those parents and their ancestors all came from the same small group. The smaller the founding population, and the longer the isolation, the more pronounced the effect. Think about what that means for a colony of dozens on another planet, with no genetic input from Earth. A genetically healthy Martian population, one that could sustain itself across generations without accumulating these risks to an unacceptable degree, would need to number in the hundreds at an absolute minimum. Some estimates place the floor in the low thousands, not in the first generation, not in the first century perhaps, but at some point before a colony could responsibly declare itself fully independent and sever the umbilical to Earth, it would need to have grown to a scale that no currently planned mission architecture comes close to delivering in the first several decades. Think of a seed bank. A seed bank with only 10 varieties of wheat survives the first winter and the second. But over time, without new varieties added, its capacity to adapt to disease, to drought, to unexpected conditions slowly narrows. The bank is still a bank. It still functions, but its long-term resilience is quietly, invisibly diminishing. A small founding population is a genetic seed bank with the same problem. What it carries at the start is all it has, and what it has is finite. The consequence lands hard against a particular piece of the colonization narrative. The romantic vision imagines a small, heroic founding group arriving on Mars, enduring the early years, solving the early problems, and gradually becoming self-reliant, independent, the seed of a new civilization. And in a certain sense, all of that may be true. But true independence, the kind where a Martian settlement could close the connection to Earth without catastrophic long-term consequences, requires a population far larger than heroism alone can deliver. The earliest settlements, whatever their symbolic importance, whatever their engineering achievements, would remain genetically dependent on a continuing relationship with Earth. New arrivals, new genetic material, a thread back to the homeworld that could not responsibly be cut until the numbers grew to a level that no current proposal has a near-term plan to reach. The math does not care about courage. It does not soften for ambition or sacrifice. It simply describes the floor below which the long-term project becomes fragile in ways that accumulate quietly across generations. And the genetic question was not the only invisible pressure that would accumulate quietly inside those small, sealed habitats on the surface of another world. Set the biology aside for a moment. Set aside the bone density charts and the population genetics flaw, and the question of what a Mars-born body can and cannot survive. Sit instead with something quieter, something that gets far less attention in the technical literature than radiation dosimetry or gravity physiology, but that mission psychologists rank as equally dangerous to the people inside those habitats. The distance, not as an engineering variable, as a felt reality, as the thing a human being carries around every hour of every day when the world they came from is a pale point of light in the sky, and there is no path back that can be walked quickly. Travel time between Earth and Mars, with current propulsion, runs roughly 6 to 9 months each way. That alone is a number that tends to pass through the mind without fully landing. 6 to 9 months of transit. But what follows that number is the part that reshapes the picture. Because of the way the two planets orbit the Sun, a return launch window opens only about once every 26 months. The geometry has to be right. The planets have to be positioned so that a spacecraft can make the journey on a reasonable fuel budget. When that window closes, it closes for more than 2 years. This means colonists would not pop back for holidays. They would not return for a family emergency and catch the next flight out. Those who committed to going would commit to a minimum of 2 to 3 years before any return became feasible, and many would not return at all. The mission structure does not permit the kind of relationship a person has with a place they can leave. That constraint matters on its own, but it is not the deepest layer of the isolation. The deepest layer is the communication. A radio signal, traveling at the speed of light, takes roughly 4 minutes to cross the gap between Earth and Mars when the planets are at their closest. When they are on opposite sides of the Sun, that delay stretches to around 24 minutes one way, which means a round trip for any message, any question, any reply runs somewhere between 8 minutes at best and the better part of an hour at its worst. Real-time conversation is not possible, not slowed or degraded, not possible. No phone calls, no live video. Every exchange becomes something closer to an old-fashioned letter dropped into a very slow post. You write, you send, you wait. The reply arrives minutes later, and you respond to where the other person was when they sent it, not where they are now. Think about what that means for a relationship lived over years. Think about what it means when something goes wrong on Earth. A parent becomes seriously ill. A child is struggling in a way that needs more than a message can carry. A loved one is in crisis at a moment when they need someone present. The colonist on Mars sends words of comfort knowing those words will arrive minutes after they were needed. Knowing the reply when it comes will describe a situation that has already moved on. Every connection across that gap becomes a conversation with a slight delay that cannot be closed. And that delay compounds over months into something that quietly reshapes what connection is possible at all. This is not speculation. It is a measurable consequence of orbital mechanics and the speed of light, two things that do not care about the emotional stakes. Mission psychologists have studied what isolation of this depth does to the human mind, and they have a data set that does not come from space. It comes from Antarctica. Research teams stationed at Antarctic bases through the polar winter spend months in near total isolation. No evacuation is possible during the darkest period. The group is small, the space is confined, the outside environment is lethal without protection, and the same faces appear at every meal, every work session, every waking hour for months without interruption. What those crews consistently report, documented across multiple decades of Antarctic winter, over-research, is something researchers now call the third quarter phenomenon. The dip does not hit hardest at the beginning of the deployment, when everything is new and the challenge feels manageable, and it does not hit hardest near the end, when the return is close enough to anchor motivation. It hits hardest in the middle, roughly 3/4 of the way through the deployment, once the novelty has completely worn off and the end is still far enough away that it offers no real comfort. Crews in that phase report irritability, difficulty concentrating, disrupted sleep, interpersonal conflict over things that would be trivial outside the deployment. A small annoyance that might last an hour in ordinary life can fester for days in a confined group with nowhere to go and no ability to put distance between themselves and the source of the tension. The conflict is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. But the reality was different. Antarctic crews live through this, and they survive it, and they come home. The third quarter phenomenon is difficult and real and documented. But Antarctic researchers have a flaw of rescue that Mars colonists would not have. If a medical emergency arises in an Antarctic winter over, it is genuinely hard to respond. It is not impossible. Aircraft can land. Personnel can be extracted. The environment is lethal, but not impenetrable. If a serious psychological crisis develops, there is at least a theoretical path out. On Mars, there is no path out. The environment is not merely harsh, it is permanently and completely lethal without technology. Every meter beyond the habitat wall requires a suit, a sealed supply of breathable air, a pressure envelope, and a dosimeter tracking radiation exposure. There is no stepping outside to clear your head. There is no taking a walk alone. The 5 or 8 or 12 people sharing the habitat are the entire human world available within a 40 million mile radius, and the next window to leave is more than 2 years away. This is a layer Antarctic research cannot model, not fully. The psychological weight of knowing that the environment itself is not survivable, that Earth is not just distant but essentially unreachable in any emergency, that there is no plane coming and no surface to rise to, adds a pressure that has no clean, terrestrial equivalent. NASA analog missions have tried to measure this. Long-duration studies placing small crews in Mars mimicking habitats, isolated from the outside world for months, have documented measurable increases in tension, interpersonal conflict, and cognitive fatigue as the isolation stretched past several months. This happened even among highly trained, carefully screened volunteers. People who understood the study design. People who knew exactly what they had signed up for. People who could measure their days and see the end date on a calendar. Not marginally harder. Measurably, documentably harder the longer it ran. The setup assumption is easy to understand. Isolation sounds like a secondary concern compared to radiation, or the atmospheric pressure, or the physiological unknowns of partial gravity. Those are the hazards that appear in the technical briefings. Isolation sounds soft, psychological, something that resilient, well-selected people should be able to manage. Mission psychologists do not see it that way. They rank it as a first-order danger, not a background condition to manage, a hazard as serious as the ones measured in millisieverts and bone density percentages. And the analog studies confirm it. Even screened, prepared, motivated volunteers degrade under sustained isolation. Even people who chose it and understood it. Even with an end date visible on a calendar, and an environment just outside the door that was not trying to kill them. The colonists on Mars would have none of those softening conditions. And isolation, as it turned out, would not operate alone. The distance and the delay and the confinement would not simply strain the individuals inside. They would press on something even harder to engineer around. The small group itself. The relationships that formed inside those habitats. The social fabric that a settlement would depend on, as completely as it depended on oxygen recyclers and nuclear power. That pressure and what it threatened was still ahead. The distance was only half of it. The people who studied these questions knew that isolation operated on two tracks simultaneously. The first was social, the kind the previous section traced. The people you loved reduced to text messages with a half-hour delay. The group around you pressed into close quarters with no exit. The second was sensory. The world itself, stripped of almost everything the human brain had evolved to expect from a world. Step outside on Mars and the sky above you is not blue. It is a dusty butterscotch, a pale amber orange tinted by fine particles suspended in the thin air. At sunset, the light scatters differently. The sky near the horizon where the sun descends takes on a faint bluish tint, the inverse of an Earth sunset, which flares orange and red. It is genuinely striking, alien, beautiful in its way, but it is also the only sky you will ever see for the rest of your life. No blue afternoons, no green hills under a summer sky, no ocean horizon, no rain, anywhere, ever. The same amber orange stretching across every day, with no seasons to change it, no clouds to shift it, nothing alive beneath it to give it context. The soundscape is stranger still. The Martian atmosphere is so thin that sound does not travel through it the way it does on Earth. Outdoors, the world is eerily muffled, pitches shifted, everything quieter than the visual scene suggests it should be. There are no birds, because there is no life. There are no leaves to rustle, because there are no plants. Wind exists. Dust storms exist. But even a strong Martian wind, the kind that can carry fine particles for thousands of miles, feels like a persistent hiss against a suit. Not the low roar that moves through a forest or across an open field. A hiss, and then silence. The only sounds a colonist would ever hear outdoors are the sounds they brought with them. Most of the time, they would be indoors. And indoors, the lighting would be artificial, carefully engineered to simulate the rise and fall of natural daylight across a Martian soul. This is not a comfort measure. It is a medical requirement. On Earth, research into populations living under constant artificial light without proper daylight cues consistently documents the same outcomes. Disrupted sleep, depression, metabolic irregularities, a slow degradation in mood and cognitive performance. The brain did not evolve for sealed rooms lit by panels. Every natural sensory signal it expects, the shift in morning light, the smell of soil after rain, the ambient noise of a living world, the sensation of wind and temperature change, would be absent, or simulated. And simulation, however carefully done, is not the same. But here is where it gets strange. People preparing for Mars missions often acknowledge the sensory deprivation intellectually, and then underestimate it in practice. The clinical term is sensory monotony, and its effects compound over months the way radiation dose compounds, quietly, below the threshold of any single day's awareness, until the accumulation becomes visible. Mission psychologists who study this specific question do not describe it as an inconvenience to manage. They describe it as one of the less discussed contributions to psychological decline. And then there is the night sky. The first time a colonist walks outside under a dark Martian sky and searches for Earth, they will find it. It is visible to the naked eye under the right conditions, but it is not the Earth they carried in their imagination. It is a small, faint, blue-tinged point of light, indistinguishable at a glance from any other star in a crowded sky. Everyone they ever loved exists on that point. Every city they ever walked through, every smell tied to a specific memory, the entire accumulated weight of a life. Not glowing, not luminous, a star among stars, distinguishable only because they know which one to look for. Astronauts in low Earth orbit describe something called the overview effect. Looking down at Earth from a few hundred miles up, they report a visceral shift in perspective, a sudden embodied understanding of the planet's fragility and unity that many describe as one of the most profound experiences of their lives. Earth fills the window. Its thin atmosphere is visible as a delicate membrane. The experience tends to change people. What Mars colonists feel is something related, but fundamentally different. Not wonder at the smallness of the planet they are looking at. The quieter, stranger recognition that home has been reduced to an anonymous point of light, no brighter than any distant sun. Mission psychologists consider this moment significant enough to prepare colonists for it in advance. Not because they think preparation makes it easier, because people consistently underestimate how disorienting it is until they're standing there, looking at a star-sized Earth and feeling the distance between the two. The stimulation problem reaches further than the sky and the silence. On Earth, ordinary life is threaded with low-effort novelty, the texture of variety that most people never consciously notice because it has always been there. A different route to work, a new restaurant, an overheard conversation in a crowd, a weekend trip, the small sensory anchors, a particular smell, the feel of a fabric, the taste of something specific to a place, that quietly confirm a person is still embedded in a familiar world. On Mars, those anchors vanish. There are no new restaurants, no concerts, no crowds to disappear into, no spontaneous decisions that carry a person somewhere different. Digital media arrives, but on a delay. Movies, books, music, games transmitted from Earth are stored locally. A colonist can watch new films, read new books, follow Earth culture across the communication gap. But the experience of engaging with something at the same moment the rest of humanity engages with it, the shared cultural rhythm of a new release or a public event, is gone. Culture arrives on Mars already past, already discussed, already absorbed by a world that moved on while the signal was in transit. Structured recreation under these conditions stops being a luxury. It becomes, in the language that prison psychologists and polar station planners have used for decades, something close to a medical necessity. Both populations, long-term inmates and personnel overwintering in Antarctic bases, require deliberate scheduling of meaningful activity not because recreation is pleasant, but because unstructured boredom, layered onto unrelenting stress, is a well-documented path toward declining mental health. The pattern holds in controlled environments that are far less demanding than a Mars habitat. On Mars, the prescription for structured hobbies, creative work, physical exercise, and purposeful shared activity would not be a wellness recommendation. It would sit next to the oxygen recyclers on the list of things the mission could not afford to neglect. Even something as small as craving a specific taste, tied to a memory, becomes an absence with no resolution. A smell that belonged to a particular place. A sensation the body keeps expecting and stops receiving. Mars offers none of the quiet sensory reassurances that a person's nervous system uses without conscious thought to confirm that the world is still the world they understand. The sensory environment was not a threat in the way radiation and pressure were threats. It was slower, more diffuse. The kind of damage it could do accumulated below the threshold of any single moment's awareness, the way cold did, the way dust did, and it would operate not in isolation, but in combination with everything else the habitat pressed against the people inside it. The social fabric, already strained, would be carrying this weight too. What that combination could eventually threaten was something the mission planners had been thinking about carefully. Because the risk did not stop at the individual. It extended to the group, and the group was all there was. Beneath every psychological burden sits a blunter question. Before a colonist can feel isolated, before the sensory monotony compounds, before the social fabric stretches under months of confinement, the colony has to eat. It has to drink. And eventually, if anyone is ever going to leave Mars, it has to make its own fuel. These are not details to be sorted later. They are the daily physical foundation everything else rests on. And each one turns out to be a fragile, energy-hungry industrial problem that concept art almost never shows. Start with food. The popular image of a Mars colony includes greenhouse domes, rows of green crops growing under filtered sunlight, thriving in Martian soil, feeding the people inside. It is a reasonable image. It is also misleading in almost every specific detail. Martian soil cannot be used for direct planting, not without extensive treatment. The soil is contaminated with perchlorates, reactive chemical salts, toxic to the thyroid, and disruptive to basic metabolic function. The same dust that finds its way into suits and airlocks is laced with compounds that would accumulate in food grown in untreated ground. So crops on Mars would require sealed, climate-controlled greenhouse modules, carefully managed growing media, and hydroponic or aeroponic systems that bypass the soil problem entirely. Earth experiments using simulated Martian regolith have shown that certain hardy crops can grow under those conditions. Specific lettuce varieties, radishes, some grains, but yields are limited. The energy, water, and controlled environment required to grow meaningful quantities for a whole colony is enormous, and the greenhouse has problems that run deeper than the soil. Plants need pollination. On Earth, bees handle most of it, alongside other insects and wind. A sealed module on Mars has none of those. Some designs have proposed importing small, carefully managed insect populations, but insects in a closed environment with no natural predators are not a stable system. Too few and the crops go unpollinated. Too many and the only food source becomes a pest problem, with no way to contain it from outside. Many early greenhouse designs favor a different solution: hand pollination. A small brush, moved from flower to flower, one at a time, by a colonist who also has life support systems to monitor and equipment to maintain. It is slow, it is repetitive, it adds yet another daily labor burden to people already carrying a great deal. Lighting adds another layer. Martian sunlight is weaker than Earth's to begin with, and atmospheric dust cuts it further. Many crops would need continuous supplemental LED grow lights tuned to the specific wavelengths plants use most efficiently. Those lights run all the time. They draw from the same limited power budget that covers heating, life support, and manufacturing. Every watt going to a grow light is a watt not going somewhere else. But here is where the greenhouse problem reaches its most acute form: disease. A single unchecked fungal infection or bacterial outbreak inside a sealed greenhouse module has no natural boundaries. On Earth, a farm can lose one field while others keep producing. A Mars colony cannot sacrifice one section for a season while the rest recovers. There is no rest of the farm. There is only this greenhouse in this habitat, growing food for these people. And if replacement seeds or crops are needed from Earth, the earliest they could arrive is many months away. The result of all of this is not a thriving garden feeding a colony. Not in the early years. Early colonists would rely heavily on prepackaged, shelf-stable food shipped from Earth, calorie-dense, nutritionally engineered, repetitive, closer to military field rations or long-duration submarine food than anything resembling a meal chosen for pleasure. The psychological comfort that food normally provides, the culture in it, the celebration, the simple pleasure of something tasting like home would be stripped down to fuel. For the first years at minimum, possibly longer. The greenhouse would be a struggling supplement, not a foundation. Water follows a similar arc. Mars has water, mostly as ice at the poles, and in subsurface deposits detected by orbiting spacecraft. Extracting and purifying that ice would be one of the first industrial tasks any colony must master, because shipping water from Earth is wildly impractical at launch costs. Local water is available in principle, but having it and using it safely are different problems. Even with local water, a colony must run closed-loop recycling of a kind that makes the ISS look relaxed. The ISS already recovers well over 90% of its onboard water, filtering and purifying wastewater, reclaiming moisture from breath, recycling liquid that no one on Earth would describe as something they wanted to drink. A Mars colony would need to push that efficiency even further, because losing even a small percentage to leaks or system inefficiency does not stay small. It compounds over years. In an environment with no easy resupply, a water reclamation system that performs at 92% instead of 95% is not a minor shortfall. It is a slow-motion emergency that announces itself months before it becomes critical and demands a solution that may not exist nearby. Every drop tracked, every seal monitored, any failure in the reclamation chain becoming a problem that does not wait. Fuel is where the dependency most people never consider announces itself. A rocket sitting on Mars cannot refuel the way a vehicle stops at a gas station. Carrying enough return fuel from Earth would make missions so heavy and expensive that the numbers stop working at all. So return fuel must be made on Mars, from materials Mars provides. This is where in situ resource utilization becomes essential. ISRU for short, meaning the use of local resources to manufacture what the mission needs, rather than shipping it from home. Mars provides two key ingredients. Its atmosphere is thin, but rich in carbon dioxide. Its surface holds water ice. Combine those two resources in the right reactions, and you can produce propellant. The Sabatier reaction takes carbon dioxide and hydrogen, and produces methane and water. Electrolysis takes water and separates it into hydrogen and oxygen. Both are real, proven chemistry. Neither is exotic. The challenge is not the chemistry. NASA demonstrated part of the concept with MOXIE, an instrument aboard the Perseverance rover which successfully extracted oxygen directly from the Martian atmosphere on a small scale. It worked. That was meaningful. It was also about the size of a car battery, producing oxygen in quantities measured in grams per hour. Scaling that to the many tons a real return vehicle needs is a different problem entirely. Not a bigger version of the same engineering. An entirely different level of industrial commitment. Large, power-hungry equipment running continuously for months before a return launch window even opens. Running largely unattended, in one of the most hostile industrial environments humans have ever attempted to operate in. With no backup plant waiting on standby. With no way to order replacement parts on a reasonable timeline. With the entire departure timeline hinging on a chemical facility performing correctly, start to finish, before the window closes. If it underperforms, the window does not wait. If it breaks down and cannot be repaired with what is available on site, the people who need that fuel stay. We do not yet fully know how to guarantee that process at the scale required. We know the chemistry works. We know MOXIE demonstrated a piece of it. The gap between that demonstration and a functioning full-scale propellant plant running reliably through a Martian winter is enormous, and it remains an open question that no mission architecture has yet answered. Food, water, fuel. 3 things every early colonist would need before the day was out, and 3 industrial systems that would need to perform without failure in an environment specifically hostile to that requirement. And these were only the consumables. The physical infrastructure the colony would depend on for its daily existence was a separate challenge, already waiting. Every one of those systems shares the same brutal arithmetic, and it reaches into the smallest corners of daily life. Take water. On Earth, a shower is barely a decision. You turn the handle, you stand there as long as you want, and you think nothing of it. On Mars, every gallon of water pulled into a showerhead is a gallon not available for drinking, not available for the greenhouse, not available for cooling equipment, not available for electrolysis splitting hydrogen and oxygen for breathable air. Every gallon must be accounted for somewhere else in a budget that has no slack. The realistic answer to hygiene on Mars is not a shower at all. It is a sponge, no rinse soap, drastically reduced laundry, because running a washing machine on Mars would be an enormous, essentially unjustifiable water expense. Clothing would need to be more durable, more reused, built from antimicrobial fabrics engineered to resist odor and bacterial buildup, far longer than ordinary cotton or synthetic blends. And even that would only be partly effective. The same fine, sharp, electrostatically charged dust that threatens lungs works its way into fabric fibers over time, degrading them from the inside. Truly clean clothing on Mars would be a rare luxury, not a small inconvenience, a fact of life for years at a stretch. The suits that connect colonists to the outside world carry their own compounding burden. A spacesuit is a complex, expensive piece of engineering, and it wears out. Joints degrade from repeated movement, seals weaken from temperature swings, and abrasive dust carried on every excursion. On the ISS today, suits are carefully inspected and maintained after every single use, because the cost of missing a slow failure is not a torn seam, but a life. A small Mars colony would need a carefully maintained inventory of working suits, spare components, and trained maintenance staff, whose sole job was keeping enough of them functional at all times. A shortage of working suits means a shortage of anyone who can safely go outside. And something as minor as a torn glove liner or a failing zipper seal, the kind of damage that costs almost nothing on Earth to replace, becomes serious when the margin between a working seal and a fatal pressure leak is measured in seconds. The same logic extends to every specialized system inside the habitat. Lighting rigs calibrated to shift color temperature through each Martian day, to reinforce normal sleep cycles and prevent circadian collapse. Exercise machines built on principles completely different from anything in a commercial gym, because ordinary treadmills rely on gravity to hold a runner's feet against the belt, which works on Earth and fails in reduced gravity without a harness system holding the person down, a design similar to what astronauts on the ISS already use. Every such system shipped from Earth, maintained without a hardware store, kept running indefinitely, because there is no low-stakes version of any of it, and no consumer replacement available at any shop within 40 million miles. But something was wrong. The single most frightening fact about living on Mars is not any specific hazard. It is the structure underneath all of them. Colonists depend on an unbroken chain of mechanical and chemical systems for the most basic survival needs, every hour of every day, with essentially no backup and help, potentially a year or more away. On Earth, if ventilation fails, you open a window. On Mars, opening a window means you are gone within roughly 2 minutes. On Earth, a life support failure brings emergency services within hours. On Mars, a critical failure at the wrong point in the 26-month launch cycle means no external help can arrive regardless of money or urgency, because orbital mechanics does not respond to emergencies. The geometry simply will not allow a faster trip. This is fundamentally unlike any prior colonization humans have attempted. Explorers who settled harsh deserts, remote islands, and frozen tundra were still breathing Earth's air, still standing in Earth's gravity, still shielded by Earth's magnetic field, still theoretically reachable. Mars removes every one of those safety nets at the same time. Ordinary, statistically likely events: an appendicitis case with no surgeon, a greenhouse failure with no resupply arriving for months, a dust storm starving solar panels when backup power is already low, carry the weight of true emergencies every time they occur. Not occasionally, routinely over years, in a place where no single mistake gets to be ordinary. This reality shapes every object on the surface. Even with reusable rockets reducing costs dramatically compared to earlier eras, delivering a single kilogram to the Martian surface still costs a substantial sum applied without exception to everything. Water, medicine, spare parts, clothing, tools, food. Each kilogram of anything was carried on a rocket that fought gravity and covered hundreds of millions of miles to put it there. That fact inverts the psychology of ownership. On Earth, replacing a broken tool is often cheaper and faster than repairing it. On Mars, the logic reverses completely. Every item is repaired. Every seal is patched. Every worn component is refurbished and squeezed for every last use. Colonists would develop an intensely resourceful, almost obsessive repair culture closer to households that lived through wartime rationing than to the disposable convenience of modern Earth. A broken zipper pull is worth fixing. A cracked container is worth patching. Throwing anything away means permanently losing a resource that took enormous energy, money, and risk to put in that room. That is not a philosophy. That is arithmetic. Power underpins every piece of this. Heating, water reclamation, oxygen production, greenhouse lighting, manufacturing under radiation shielding, all of it runs on steady, uninterrupted electricity. Solar looks appealing on paper, and early robotic missions used it successfully. But a single dust storm can choke available sunlight for weeks. Even on clear days, Mars receives significantly less solar energy per square foot than Earth does, simply because it sits farther from the sun. Panels also need constant cleaning, because the same clinging electrostatically charged dust that degrades suits and fabrics coats solar panels within days of cleaning them. So most serious proposals lean on small nuclear fission reactors as primary power. The kilopower reactor design developed by NASA for potential Mars and lunar surface missions offers steady, weather-independent energy that does not care whether a storm has been running for 3 weeks. But nuclear brings its own demands: shielding, cooling in an atmosphere too thin to carry heat away efficiently. The complexity of running a reactor reliably for years, with a small crew and no rapid access to replacement components. Whatever the source, losing power on Mars is not an Earth blackout ridden out with candles and a flashlight. It simultaneously kills heat, because without continuous heating, the habitat temperatures plunge within hours toward the ambient surface. It kills oxygen production. It kills water reclamation. One malfunction cascades into a race against the clock on 3 fronts at once. Mission planners estimate that even a small outpost housing 4 to 6 people needs roughly 25 to 40 kilowatts of continuous power once life support, heating, greenhouse lighting, and basic industrial equipment run together. That is roughly the equivalent of powering several dozen average American homes, but with zero tolerance for outages and no regional grid to borrow from when something fails. Scaled to dozens or hundreds of people, the infrastructure begins to resemble a small dedicated municipal utility. One that the colony built entirely itself, maintains entirely itself, and cannot connect to anything outside its own walls. The supply chain underneath all of this is the quiet fragility that planners lose sleep over. On Earth, a failed bolt or burned out circuit board is replaced within days. On Mars, especially in the early decades, there are no local factories producing precision components, no hardware store with a bin of the right fittings, no overnight delivery. Every spare part not already stockpiled waits for the next launch window, which might be over a year away. Engineers lean on 3D printers and small-scale on-site manufacturing to close that gap, fabricating replacement parts from locally mined or recycled material. But 3D printing has real limits. It works for certain plastics and some metals. It cannot yet reliably reproduce every specialized electronic component, every precision machined seal, every sensitive instrument that a complex life support chain might need. So every planning session before a mission departs involves a high-stakes calculation. Which spare parts are worth the launch cost? Which failures are considered survivable without a backup component? Guessing wrong on one seemingly minor item, a valve rated for a specific pressure, a sensor calibrated for a specific chemical process, could leave a subsystem offline for over a year because of a single part that cost nearly nothing on Earth, but was never put on the manifest. The heroic images of Mars exploration show none of this. They show vistas, suits, and footprints. What they do not show is the colonist on their knees in a maintenance corridor, carefully disassembling a worn joint seal for the 3rd time to see if it has one more use left. That is the defining texture of daily life on Mars, not grand exploration, an obsessive, resourceful, wartime rationing repair culture in which nothing is throwaway and a broken zipper matters. And the harder truth is that all of this, the water budgets, the suits, the power demands, the spare parts calculations, is the stable condition, the condition when everything is working. There was still an entire dimension of the human cost that the numbers and maintenance schedules could not fully capture. Parts are not the only thing you can't reorder in time. The same is true when a person breaks down. Think about what a colony actually brings for medical care. Not a hospital, not a surgical team, not a specialist for every condition a human body can develop. What it brings is a small group of people with cross-training, a medical kit, and software. That is the complete inventory. And for at least the first decade of any realistic Mars mission, that may be all there ever is. The assumption most people carry is that a serious mission would bring serious medical support, that a colony bound for another planet would pack a functioning clinic at minimum. But sending a fully equipped hospital to Mars, the surgeons, the imaging equipment, the pharmaceutical supply chain, the laboratory infrastructure to process complex diagnostics would be enormously expensive. And it would still leave colonists without most of the tools that depend on large machinery or Earth-based laboratory support to produce a result. So you accept the constraint. You bring what you can, and you train everyone to be a generalist the way staff at remote Antarctic research stations already are, knowing that generalist training only goes so far when a genuinely serious condition arrives. Here is where the constraint stops being abstract. A broken bone is manageable. Basic fracture care is within reach of trained personnel working with portable equipment. But an unusual infection, a cardiac event, a condition requiring surgery beyond the skill set of whoever happens to be standing there. That is where the picture changes. No evacuation, no transfer to a better facility. Whatever happens in that habitat is what happens. There is no other option that orbital mechanics allows. And then there is the dental problem. It sounds minor. It is not minor. A small colony in its early years almost certainly would not include a dedicated dentist. A cavity, a cracked tooth, a developing abscess, the kind of thing that gets a same-week appointment on Earth and is resolved in an hour, becomes months of real pain and escalating infection risk with no specialist available, not a minor inconvenience, a genuine health problem with no clean solution. The colony would lean on software. Medical care in those early years would rely heavily on trained diagnostic systems that can interpret imaging results, flag abnormal lab values, and suggest treatment paths. An automated second opinion standing in for the absent specialist. And in many situations, that would be enough. Straightforward presentations, familiar conditions, cases that fit clearly within the software's training. But software has real limits when a genuinely rare or complex condition appears. When the presentation is unusual, when the variables don't resolve cleanly, the colony's primary medical responder would face life or death judgment calls under enormous pressure. Knowing a wrong decision could cost a colleague their life with no more qualified expert reachable in any amount of time. That is not a theoretical scenario. That is a structural feature of early Mars medicine. Some proposals have suggested telesurgical robotic systems. The idea is that an Earth specialist could remotely guide a robotic arm through a procedure using carefully pre-planned movements that account for the communication delay rather than live control. Not real-time surgery. Something closer to a detailed pre-rehearsed sequence executed on the other end. But this remains experimental, unproven beyond the most basic procedures. The earliest colonies would be managing nearly everything with the training, judgment, and improvisation of whoever is physically present. The picture did not hold. Even the medicines themselves may not last. Medications degrade. That is a known property of pharmaceuticals, and on Earth it is managed by expiration dates and reliable resupply. On Mars, degradation can accelerate. The radiation environment and the temperature swings of long transit and the Martian surface both attack pharmaceutical chemistry over time. A supply of antidepressants, antibiotics, or other essential medications might quietly lose potency before a resupply mission could replace them. Imagine a medicine cabinet where everything inside has an expiration date and no delivery is coming. The medicines do not announce their decline. The colony works around them, adjusts doses, hopes. And hopes is not a clinical strategy. Mental health care carries its own version of this constraint. A colony might include 1 or 2 crew members with some counseling training, but genuine specialized psychiatric care, adjusting medications for side effects, sustained ongoing therapy for serious conditions would be extremely limited or absent for years. The cruel architecture of it is that the isolation creating the psychological need is precisely the thing that removes the resources to address it. The two conditions reinforce each other, and the medications meant to help may be the ones quietly expiring in the cabinet. Pregnancy adds an entirely different layer of the unknown. No woman has carried a pregnancy to term outside Earth's gravity and magnetic field. The radiation exposure during critical fetal developmental windows is a serious, unresolved concern that mission planners treat with extreme caution. What does sustained Mars-level radiation do to a developing nervous system in its most vulnerable phase? What does reduced gravity do to fetal development from the earliest weeks? The honest answer is that no one knows. Mission architects for the first expeditions would almost certainly restrict or very carefully manage pregnancies until far more data exists. Something ordinary and joyous elsewhere becomes something requiring extraordinary oversight and the acceptance of genuinely unknown risk. This connects to the developmental questions already raised about children growing up on Mars. But those questions begin before birth. None of this is the cost the mission pays on arrival. Most of it is paid before departure. Realistic training programs for Mars colonists would take years, not months, years. Advanced medical cross-training, mechanical repair, geology, botany, the specific engineering systems of the spacecraft and habitat. Candidates pass rigorous psychological screening designed to filter out those most likely to fracture under extreme isolation. And even then, no screening can fully predict how a specific person responds to years of confinement until they are actually living it. The selection process finds the most resilient candidates it can find. It cannot guarantee resilience it cannot yet measure. The families of selected colonists carry their own version of that cost. A parent, a sibling, a child departing for a mission measured in years, with real probability of tragedy and with genuine uncertainty about whether a return ever becomes viable in that colonist's lifetime. On Earth, watching someone leave for a dangerous job still means knowing rescue services exist, that emergencies have response infrastructure, that the phone works in real time. Watching someone leave for Mars means none of those things apply. The separation is clean and maybe permanent, and the financial weight underneath all of it is staggering. A single crewed Mars mission, once launch vehicles, life support systems, habitats, and years of prior testing are counted together, runs into the tens of billions of dollars. Every outbound seat represents an investment that's scale riding on one individual's health, competence, and psychological resilience. Not a team, not an institution, one person on that day with whatever that day brings. The medicine may have already expired, the specialist was never there, and the mission was always going to ask more of the human body than the human body was ever designed to give. Now put a few dozen of those people in one sealed structure and ask how they hold together. Each one carries the medical uncertainty, the radiation exposure, the physical adaptation, the grief of departure. Each one knows the communication delay, the narrow launch windows, the probability that return is years away or never. Now multiply that by 30 or 50 or 100. Each person with their own fear, their own grief, their own needs, their own rhythm of sleeping and waking, their own tolerance for conflict and for silence. No exit for any of them. No neighboring town to walk to. No outside authority to call when something goes wrong. A Mars colony, from its first day, functions like a tiny nation-state with no immigration, no emigration, and no appeals court. It has to decide how resources are shared, how work is divided, who holds authority in a crisis, and how a conflict between two people living 15 feet apart gets resolved when neither of them can leave. On Earth, even the most isolated communities have an outside world to lean against. A polar research station can airlift someone out. A remote fishing village can send a boat to the next harbour. A dissatisfied resident of almost any community on Earth can simply go somewhere else. A Mars colonist cannot. Historians and sociologists who study small, isolated communities have found this consistently. Polar expeditions, closed religious settlements, long-duration submarine crews. In almost every case, the single biggest predictor of whether an isolated group thrives or fractures is not the quality of their equipment or the skill of their planning. It is social cohesion, simple human cohesion, the ability of a small group to manage conflict, distribute trust, and sustain kindness toward one another under conditions of extreme stress. A colony's survival depends as much on diplomacy and basic human decency as on oxygen generators and radiation shielding. There is no HR department. There is no outside police. There is no simple exit for anyone in an unbearable situation with a fellow colonist. The interpersonal pool itself adds a quieter, slower strain. A colony of dozens to low hundreds selects its members for technical skill and psychological resilience, not for romantic compatibility or social range. That is a narrow pool, chosen for survival, not for the full variety of connection human beings need over years. Some colonists might find it liberating. The noise of Earth's dating culture, its complications and social performances, simply gone. Others would find it a genuine, ongoing source of loneliness that professional fulfillment could not offset. No new faces, no unexpected connections. The same small group, indefinitely. Children born and raised on Mars face a version of this that is sharper still. A Martian child grows up with a peer group smaller than almost any Earth child experiences anywhere. No wide range of friendships, no subcultures to drift through, no social experimentation across a varied and unpredictable community. Education would lean on remote instruction and whatever specialist the colony happens to include. That instruction could be academically excellent. Remote delivery can cover enormous intellectual ground, but it cannot replace the social texture of a large, varied community of children growing up together. Martian children would reach adulthood without ever having experienced it. Then the data shifted. People looking at all of this from the outside often reach for a reassuring counter-argument. They point to the missions, the analogs, the proof of concept studies that show human beings can handle extreme isolation and still function. And those studies are real. The evidence is real. But the evidence says something more complicated than reassurance. Take the Apollo 13 mission in 1970. After an onboard explosion forced the crew into a smaller module than its scrubber system was designed to handle, they faced rising carbon dioxide with no obvious solution. Ground controllers talked them through building a makeshift CO2 filter from spare parts, tape, and a plastic bag. The crew survived. It is one of the most celebrated examples of human improvisation under pressure in spaceflight history. But it worked because Earth was close enough. The communication delay between Earth and the Apollo 13 crew was measured in fractions of a second. Ground teams had duplicate simulators, thousands of engineers, and hours to devise a solution. They could diagnose in real time, prototype in real time, and talk the crew through it in real time. A Mars colony facing a similar CO2 buildup would have a communication delay measured in minutes each way, physical help months away, and no Apollo 13-style ground team with a duplicate habitat standing by. Colonists would need to carry enough on-site expertise, enough spare scrubber capacity, and enough procedural knowledge to diagnose and fix the problem themselves the first time, with no one on the other end of the radio who could speak back to them before the carbon dioxide climbed further. The rescue was the proximity. Remove the proximity and the lesson changes. The longer analog studies confirm what Apollo 13 illustrates. HICs, a NASA-funded program based on a barren volcanic landscape in Hawaii, placed small crews in a dome-shaped habitat for missions lasting up to a full year. Conditions mimicked Mars-like constraints: rationed water, portioned food, mandatory pressure suits for any outside excursion, and communication deliberately delayed by 20 minutes each way. What the missions documented was a particular shape to psychological deterioration. Small irritations that crews laughed off in week 1 became real friction by month 8. Some missions ended early. Crew members described forgetting what rain sounded like, craving specific foods with a specific intensity, feeling profoundly and irreversibly changed by what the isolation had done to them. Russia's Mars 500 program sealed a crew inside a mock-up spacecraft for 520 days, matching the realistic profile of a round-trip Mars mission. The crew knew they could open a door and walk outside if a genuine emergency arose. They knew the whole time. And still, the study documented mood decline, disrupted sleep, and interpersonal strain building across those months. Not at the end. Building. Even with the emergency door. On real Mars, no such door exists. Biosphere 2, a sealed ecological experiment in Arizona in the early 1990s, was designed to demonstrate that a small crew could sustain themselves inside a closed system. It ran into serious problems. Oxygen levels dropped unexpectedly low, requiring outside air to be pumped in. But the more persistent finding was the human one. Conflict inside the facility grew severe enough that, per accounts from participants, some crew members stopped speaking to each other entirely, while still living and working together every day. Every one of these experiments was voluntary. Every participant knew the study design, knew the timeline, knew a support team was on the other side of the wall. Mars removes every one of those conditions and replaces them with genuine physical danger, genuine distance, and genuine permanence. The degradation the analog missions revealed was the floor, not the ceiling. Extreme Earth postings pushed the comparison further. At the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, winter crews endure months of continuous darkness with no flights in or out once the deep cold sets in. Aircraft systems cannot reliably function in those temperatures. Station doctors have navigated medical emergencies by radio consultation with distant specialists, occasionally performing procedures on themselves because evacuation was impossible until conditions improved months later. Russia's Vostok station on the Antarctic ice sheet holds the record for the coldest natural air temperature ever reliably measured on Earth. Crews stationed there describe a specific cognitive effect after enough consecutive cutoff months: a slowed thinking and emotional flattening. Researchers who study it do not classify it as simple unhappiness. It is a recognized physiological response to extreme prolonged isolation. The brain changes under those conditions, not metaphorically, measurably. And yet Vostok, brutal as it is, happens on Earth. Familiar gravity, unmodified air beyond the station walls, rescue theoretically possible if weather and logistics align. Every one of those conditions offers a floor that Mars does not provide. On Mars, the atmosphere is not air someone could breathe in an emergency. The gravity is not the gravity a human body was built in. The isolation is not temporary by any definition a rescue timetable could satisfy. When the analog missions and the polar stations are held up as evidence that humans can endure, the honest reading of that evidence is more uncomfortable than the reassuring one. Not proof that we are ready, proof of how much strain humans already show when the exit is merely difficult. The exit on Mars is not difficult. It does not exist. And the gap between those two conditions is where the real weight of this section lives. Set aside the crises for a moment, the radiation, the pressure failure, the dust storm turning into a weeks-long siege. Those are the threats that fill the imagination because they are large enough to name. But much of the real toll on Mars would not arrive as a crisis. It would arrive as something smaller, something that never quite stops. Start with time. A Martian day, called a sol, runs about 39 minutes longer than an Earth day. That sounds like almost nothing. It is the length of a lunch break, a short commute. But the human body runs on a clock calibrated over millions of years to a 24-hour cycle, and a 39-minute daily surplus never resolves. It compounds. Engineers at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory have lived on Mars time during critical rover operations, shifting their schedules roughly 40 minutes later with each passing day to stay synchronized with the rover's solar position. Within a couple of weeks, people who began working in daylight found themselves reporting for duty in the middle of the Earth night without ever crossing a time zone. They described it as a permanent rolling case of jet lag. Not the jet lag of a transatlantic flight that fades after a few days. A jet lag that never fades because the mismatch never stops accumulating. For a colonist, this is not a rotation. It is the permanent condition of an entire life. The body's circadian rhythms never stop pulling toward a rhythm Mars never provides. Day after day after day, the mismatch grinds on. And then, there is the exercise. On the International Space Station, astronauts spend roughly 2 hours every single day on specialized resistance equipment, specifically designed to fight bone density loss and muscle atrophy in microgravity. 2 hours. Every day. And even with that regimen, some loss still occurs. Mars colonists would face an equivalent requirement, not a lifestyle choice, a medical prescription. Skipping a workout on Mars does not mean feeling sluggish the next morning. It means measurably accelerating bone density loss that over years raises fracture risk in ordinary daily activities. Bones that were already adapting to a gravitational environment they were never built for, weakening faster without the daily maintenance that slows the process. A non-negotiable daily prescription layered on top of every other task the day demands. That is when the pattern broke. The threats to daily life on Mars are not only biological. The ground itself is not entirely stable. NASA's InSight lander, using a seismometer placed directly on the Martian surface, detected more than 1,300 Marsquakes over the course of its mission. Generally weaker than Earth's most powerful earthquakes, but real, ongoing. The interior of Mars is still shifting. A permanent habitat, especially one built partly underground or inside a lava tube for radiation protection, must be engineered and continuously monitored for this movement. Structural reinforcement added to a project already carrying every other hazard. The ground refusing to offer what Earth dwellers assume without thinking. A stable foundation. Above the surface, a different threat moves fast. Earth's thick atmosphere burns up most small meteoroids before they reach the ground. They streak across the sky as harmless shooting stars, and are gone. Mars's atmosphere is thin enough that objects which would disintegrate entirely over Earth can reach the surface at dangerous speeds. Orbital imaging has captured new impact craters forming within a single human observing career, confirming the frequency is not theoretical. Any habitat roof or wall represents a surface a small, fast-moving object could breach. The daily probability is extremely low. Across a decade of habitation, it is not zero. One more thing to engineer for. One more quiet variable that never drops out of the calculation. The nights offer no real reprieve. Studies of International Space Station astronauts show that many struggle to get genuinely restful sleep, even with comfortable sleeping arrangements. Part of it is the unfamiliar environment. Part of it is the psychological weight of a setting that never lets the nervous system fully relax. On Mars, those pressures would be amplified and joined by something simpler. The habitat never goes quiet. Life support systems cannot run silently. Fans circulate air continuously, because without gravity-driven convection, stagnant air pockets in a sealed module could allow carbon dioxide to build up around a sleeping person's face. Pumps cycle water and coolant. Compressors manage pressure. The result is a persistent low-level mechanical hum that never fully stops, day or night, month after month. Not loud, not dramatic, just always there. Poor sleep compounds nearly every other problem a colonist faces. Mood worsens. Reaction times slow during safety-critical tasks. Immunity weakens at exactly the moment radiation and isolation are already straining it. And the sleep that is most restorative, the deep, uninterrupted kind, is the kind least available in a place that never falls completely silent. The body registers all of it, including the parts that seem too minor to mention. To conserve water and reduce strain on air handling systems, habitat humidity would likely stay lower than a typical Earth home. Filtered, recirculated air that never picks up the moisture of rain or open water or soil would leave colonists with chronic dry skin, chapped lips, and irritated sinuses. Static electricity, worsened by low humidity and the fine charged dust that makes its way inside despite decontamination protocols, becomes a constant nuisance. Small shocks touching metal surfaces, a persistent threat to sensitive electronics that static can quietly damage. None of this is life-threatening in isolation. But stacked on top of interrupted sleep and mandatory daily exercise and the circadian drift that never resolves, it wears at patients in a way no single dramatic crisis could. Dramatic crises end. These do not. Communication with home would carry its own quiet weight. The communication delay between Earth and Mars has been covered before, but the bandwidth problem runs alongside the delay in a way that shapes daily life differently. Transmitting data across that distance requires careful power management and large antenna systems. Colonists would not have anything resembling unlimited internet. Video calls, when possible at all, would be short, scheduled, and low resolution, rationed the way long-distance telephone calls once were before modern telecommunications made unlimited conversation effortless. Some messages might be reviewed by mission support teams for safety or operational reasons. The sense of fully private, unmonitored communication that people on Earth take for granted, with family and friends, would be diminished. Frustration, grief, personal struggles, the things a person needs to say to someone who loves them without any audience, would need new outlets. Journaling, structured counseling with whatever psychological support the colony could provide on site. Learning to carry certain burdens more privately than a human being was built to carry them. None of these things, taken alone, would appear on a list of existential threats to a Mars colony. A slightly longer day, 2 hours of exercise, a persistent hum, dry skin, rationed video calls. Against radiation and pressure failure and dust storms and the mathematics of population genetics, each one sounds almost trivial. That is exactly the point. Mars does not refuse to offer stability in only the large and dramatic ways. It refuses across the full range, from the structural to the cellular to the circadian. Not a single stable foundation for anything. Not the air, not the temperature, not the ground, not the sleep cycle, not the body itself. Every part of daily life built around constant layered contingency planning, rather than the comfortable assumption of stability that Earth dwellers carry unconsciously through every ordinary day. The crises are not the whole weight. The accumulation is. And the accumulation never rests. Step back from the daily grind for a moment. Because underneath all of it, underneath the circadian mismatch and the hum and the rationed calls, there are larger questions the colony would face. Structural questions. Scientific and legal and civilizational questions. The ones people tend to invoke when they want to argue that all the hardship is worth it, or that it will eventually be engineered away. Those questions deserve honest answers. Start with one that most people never think about at all. A human body cannot be sterilized, not in any meaningful sense. A robotic mission to Mars goes through extraordinary decontamination protocols, heated and irradiated and cleaned, to reduce microbial contamination to vanishingly small counts before it ever leaves Earth. A human being carries something like 38 trillion microorganisms in the gut alone. More on the skin, more in the breath. Some of those microorganisms are remarkably hardy. Some could potentially survive introduction into sheltered Martian environments. Briny subsurface pockets, shielded from the harshest surface conditions, possibly existing in a liquid state under certain conditions. The kind of environment where, if Mars ever hosted life, the last holdouts might still cling on. Here is the problem. We do not yet know whether Mars ever hosted life. We do not know whether anything is still there. That question, whether life arose independently more than once in our own solar system, is arguably the most significant scientific question a human civilization could answer. And a human colony on Mars, by its very biological nature, would begin contaminating potential evidence the moment it arrived. It is not a small risk. It is an irreversible one. If Earth microbes establish themselves in a site that might otherwise preserve a record of Martian biology, that record is gone. Not degraded. Gone. The library burns, and it burns permanently. Astrobiologists have raised this concern seriously and consistently, and it does not have a clean answer. The colony would require strict decontamination protocols around scientifically sensitive regions, another procedural layer on a mission already saturated with procedural demands. But protocols are not perfect barriers. They never are. The legal structure surrounding all of this is similarly unresolved. The Outer Space Treaty, signed in the 1960s, established that no nation can claim sovereign territory on Mars or any other celestial body. Admirably fair in principle. The moon and the planets belong to no one. But the treaty was written before anyone seriously contemplated permanent settlements. It says nothing useful about how a private company establishes property rights on a world no government can claim. It says nothing about how a colony of 12 people resolves a dispute when there is no court, no police force, and no jail. It says nothing about what legal system governs a murder, a theft, or a resource-sharing breakdown in a habitat 20 minutes of signal delay from the nearest authority capable of issuing an opinion. The practical answer is that a Mars colony would improvise. It would make up rules as situations arose because it would have no other choice. The colonists would not wait for international law to catch up to their circumstances. They could not. But improvised governance under extreme stress, inside a closed system with no exit options, is exactly the kind of environment where human social systems fracture. The history of small isolated groups inventing their own rules under pressure is not uniformly encouraging. The governance questions are open. They will remain open until someone is actually living with them, probably sooner than anyone expects. Now for the largest, hoped-for solution of all: terraforming. The idea is familiar. Heat the planet by releasing trapped greenhouse gases. Divert sunlight with orbital mirrors. Thicken the atmosphere over generations until the surface pressure rises, the temperature stabilizes, and eventually, some distant century, a human being could step outside without a suit. The popular imagination loves this idea. It converts the hardship of Mars into a temporary condition, something engineering and time will eventually fix. In 2018, a study using data from NASA's Mars atmosphere probes examined the question carefully and reached an uncomfortable conclusion. There simply is not enough readily accessible carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gas locked in the present polar ice caps and Martian soil to meaningfully thicken the atmosphere using any currently understood technology, even if humanity dedicated extraordinary resources to the effort, even if it became a civilizational priority. The raw material is not there at sufficient scale. Something else was happening. Even if the material were there, the thickened atmosphere would face a second problem. Mars has no magnetic field. It lost its field billions of years ago when its core cooled and its internal dynamo stopped. That is the same chain of events that stripped the original Martian atmosphere in the first place. Solar wind does not stop. It is still flowing. A new, artificially thickened atmosphere without a magnetic field to deflect that wind would begin eroding away again. Over thousands of years, the work would be undone. The problem is not simply one of insufficient resources. It is one of insufficient planetary infrastructure, and no one knows how to rebuild a planetary magnetic field. The honest reckoning is this: walking outside without a suit on a warm, breathable Mars is not a near-term goal. It is not a medium-term goal. Per best current scientific understanding, colonists alive today, and their children, and their grandchildren, and many generations beyond, would never experience a Mars where stepping outside unprotected was survivable. The escape hatch is not there. Not in any timescale relevant to the people doing the colonizing. The last hoped-for fix is smaller in ambition, but still worth examining. Spin gravity. The idea is borrowed from science fiction. Build a rotating habitat, or a rotating section of one, that simulates closer to Earth gravity through centrifugal force. In theory, this could reduce the bone and muscle loss that comes from living at 38% of Earth gravity. In theory, it could make long-term biological survival more manageable. In practice, the engineering is formidable. A small rotation radius creates a force difference between a person's head and feet, large enough to cause dizziness and nausea. The structure must be large to avoid this problem, large enough that it represents enormous mass, moving parts requiring constant maintenance and careful integration with a habitat that otherwise sits still. No such system has been tested at meaningful scale, in orbit or on a planetary surface, and every added mechanical system on Mars is another complex system that can fail. Failure is already the greatest ongoing threat. Adding unproven moving mechanical infrastructure to a survival-critical habitat is not a conservative engineering choice. It is a gamble. So most realistic mission architecture reaches the same quiet conclusion. Colonists will live with Mars's natural 38% gravity. They will manage its effects through rigorous daily exercise and monitoring. Not because spin gravity is a bad idea in principle, but because gambling survival on an unproven mechanical solution that could become one more cascading failure at the worst possible moment is a worse idea in practice. The structural fixes people imagine rescuing the whole endeavor, the terraforming, the spin gravity, the clean legal framework waiting to be implemented, are either scientifically foreclosed for generations, mechanically unproven, or entirely unwritten. The hoped-for escape hatches do not open on any near-term timeline, and there are harder questions still ahead, so none of the escape hatches open. The structural fixes that might have softened the verdict, the terraforming, the spin gravity, the legal architecture waiting to be written, remain foreclosed, unproven, or unwritten for any timeline that matters to the first generation of colonists. Which leaves the hardest and most human question of all. Given that none of it gets easier, how would anyone survive it? And why? Knowing everything we now know, would anyone still choose to go? The first answer is adaptation. Humans are genuinely remarkable at it. The same species that survived Arctic winters in shelters made of bone and animal fat, that crossed unmapped oceans in wooden ships with no radio and no rescue, that spent months sealed inside submarines hundreds of feet below the surface, would find a way to make Mars livable in the psychological sense, even when it remains lethal in the physical one. Rituals would emerge. Suit checks before every excursion would become almost ceremonial, a practiced meditative sequence, not unlike the pre-flight checklists experienced pilots run with a calm focus that outsiders mistake for boredom. What it actually reflects is deep, hard-won competence. The check is not a formality. It is proof that the person doing it understands exactly what the suit stands between them and. That knowledge, absorbed into routine, becomes a kind of grounding. Small personal objects would take on weight entirely out of proportion to their size. A photograph from home, a saved piece of music, a journal kept faithfully across years of souls. These become anchors to identity when everything else in the environment is the same dusty color it was yesterday and will be tomorrow. And the relationships forged inside that confined, unrelenting world would likely be unlike most relationships people form on Earth. Not built from initial compatibility or shared hobbies. Built from shared hardship over years, with no possibility of walking away. Some would strain past breaking. Isolation studies predict that clearly enough. But many would become the strongest relationships anyone had ever known, born from the extremity rather than despite it. The daily reality, though, would look almost nothing like the images that populate recruitment materials and documentary films. Picture a typical morning on Mars. Artificial lighting gradually brightens inside a small private module to simulate a sunrise that is not actually visible from inside a radiation-shielded, partly buried habitat. The first real task of the day is not coffee. It is checking suit seals and personal dosimeters before any planned excursion outside. A habit as automatic as checking a phone on Earth, except failure here is measured not in missed messages, but in seconds. A shift of specialized work follows, maintaining the water reclamation system, tending the hydroponic bay, conducting geological surveys outside under strict time limits, set by suit oxygen reserves and radiation budgets. A carefully rationed meal in a communal space, eaten with the same handful of familiar faces that constitute the entire social world. A mandatory exercise session, not because anyone wants to do it, but because skipping it is a measurable health risk. Bone density declining at rates that compound across months and years. A video message recorded for home, followed by a wait of hours or days for a reply, layered with the quiet awareness of slowly pulling apart from the people left behind. Then, sleep inside walls thick enough to stop radiation, under a sky that, if visible at all through a small shielded viewport, is the same pale dusty color it has been every day for years. Movies compress this into a 2-hour story built around a single dramatic crisis. A dust storm, a rescue, a structural breach. Because that is what makes satisfying narrative. Real Martian life for the overwhelming majority of time would look nothing like that. It would be maintenance logs and equipment checks. A hydroponic bay needing nutrient levels adjusted for the 3rd time that week. A video message to a niece who was a toddler at departure and is now starting school. Growing up in ways visible only through photographs arriving on delay. Exercising on a machine for the 6,000th time, not from desire but because bones require it. The extraordinary, history-making significance would coexist strangely with some of the most repetitive, unremarkable routines imaginable. Holding both truths at once, being part of something historic, while your Tuesday still feels like an ordinary Tuesday checking valves, might be one of the quieter psychological skills every successful colonist would need. The historical comparison is tempting and worth taking seriously, but it only goes so far. Sailors crossing unmapped oceans centuries ago had no reliable communication for months, no guarantee of rescue, and no real understanding of the dangers ahead. In that sense, Mars colonists step into an old, very human tradition. But those earlier explorers were still breathing the same air, under the same gravity, within the same basic biological rules that shaped their bodies over millions of years. Mars colonists would attempt something genuinely unprecedented. Not a longer, harder version of past exploration. A fundamentally different category, closer to building a permanent city inside the vacuum-adjacent conditions of the deep ocean floor than to crossing unfamiliar land or sea. The reading came back reversed. When you lay out every individual hazard, the radiation, the cold, the isolation, the dust, the gravity, the supply fragility, any one of them sounds manageable in isolation. A person could probably endure reduced gravity if it came without everything else. Could manage isolation if isolation were the only burden. Could handle a monotonous diet if the air were breathable and the gravity familiar and the night sky still showed a recognizable moon. But real colonists face all of them together. Every day. For years. With no days off. And no simple exit. The compounding is the real threat. Not radiation alone, not cold alone, not isolation alone. All of them, simultaneously, permanently, stacked so the whole is far heavier than the sum of its parts. Isolation makes physical hardships feel heavier. Constant survival vigilance makes isolation lonelier. Monotony makes both feel longer. That is the thing glossy concept art and confident timelines never capture. The compounding. The relentless, simultaneous, ceaseless accumulation. And the margin for error inside that accumulation is effectively zero. In 1999, NASA lost the Mars Climate Orbiter, an entire spacecraft after months of travel, because one engineering team used metric units and another used imperial units for a key navigation calculation, and nobody caught the mismatch before the spacecraft was lost. That same year, 1999, the Mars polar lander went silent during descent. The most likely explanation engineers arrived at was a software error that shut off the engines prematurely, just before touchdown. These were not failures of imagination. They were small, mundane technical errors of the kind that happen constantly in complex engineering and normally get caught and corrected before they matter. On Earth, there is usually a second chance. On Mars, there is no sending a technician to check the wiring, no patching a bug once committed to final approach. Every subsystem a colony depends on carries that same unforgiving standard. An error that would be an embarrassing footnote on Earth becomes the difference between a colony that survives and one that does not. There is another cost the technical literature rarely names directly. A colonist on Mars would miss nearly every major life event back home for their entire time there. Weddings, births, graduations, the quiet ordinary passage of a parent's final years, known only through delayed messages and photographs. A colonist learning a loved one had grown seriously ill or died would face that loss without travelling home, without a funeral, often without even a real-time conversation to share the immediate grief. Reduced to a recorded message, arriving minutes or hours late, into an environment offering no privacy and no escape. Military deployments and long polar expeditions give limited insight into this, but those eventually end with a return home within months. For many Mars colonists, such loss would be processed alone, or with the small found family of fellow colonists standing impermanently for biological family forever out of reach. That reality rarely makes recruitment materials. And yet, despite everything, people would volunteer. They would compete fiercely for a handful of seats and consider the sacrifice worthwhile. This is not naive. Humans have always been drawn to projects larger than individual comfort, to the meaning that comes specifically from doing something difficult and consequential rather than easy and forgettable. Researchers who study purpose consistently find that a strong sense of meaning can sustain people through hardship that would otherwise seem unbearable. For the right person, driven less by the fantasy of red sunsets and more by a clear-eyed commitment to being part of something historically unprecedented. That meaning might be exactly enough, not despite the hardship, partly because of it. Meaning that costs nothing rarely feels worth anything. None of this makes colonization pointless. Serious engineers, scientists, and agencies consider it one of the most important long-term projects humanity could undertake, both for scientific discovery and for the survival of the species as a civilization that does not depend entirely on a single vulnerable world. But the popular imagination badly misrepresents the actual early decades. The domes, the casual outdoor strolls, the thriving greenhouse gardens, the cinematic sunsets. What those early decades would actually resemble is something closer to a permanent, unforgiving submarine mission, crossed with an Antarctic winter, crossed with a hospital ICU, sustained indefinitely, with no possibility of simply going home. The people who make that journey would not primarily be thrill-seeking adventurers. They would be something closer to extraordinarily disciplined specialists, with an almost monastic tolerance for routine risk, confinement, and sacrifice, driven by genuine conviction that the project matters enough to justify the personal cost. The cost is worth naming honestly. Living on Mars means surrendering blue skies, rain, the smell of soil after a storm, wind through actual leaves, immediate contact with loved ones in moments of grief or joy, next-day medical care for a serious illness, the simple, unconscious safety of walking outside without a suit that most humans never once think about, plus radiation quietly raising long-term risk every year, a body slowly reshaped by reduced gravity in ways medicine cannot fully predict, psychological pressure that even carefully screened, highly trained volunteers have struggled to withstand, and a planet that offers no forgiveness for carelessness, where the ordinary mistakes that are merely embarrassing on Earth become the extraordinary mistakes that end a life. This has been a long look at what the concept art never shows. Not primarily a story of red dust adventure under alien sunsets, but of discipline, constant vigilance, and the strange psychological weight of living somewhere that offers no natural forgiveness for error. The people who make Mars their permanent home will rightly be remembered as pioneers, but of a specific demanding kind, closer to submarine crews and polar researchers than to swashbuckling explorers, spending their days managing systems most of us never think about, tending machines that stand between them and instant harm, exercising for survival, and building a new human community from scratch with no safety net, no easy exit, and no chance to change their minds and go home once the ship has left. Understanding how harsh Mars is should deepen respect for what living there permanently would take, rather than dampen enthusiasm for eventually trying. The version worth getting excited about is not the sanitized, sun-drenched fantasy. It is the sobering, human reality of small groups of extraordinarily capable people choosing genuine hardship year after year in service of something larger than their own comfort, laying a foundation that later, better equipped, better adapted generations might build into something resembling a true home. A far more difficult story than the one usually told, but in its own quiet, unglamorous way, a far more remarkable one. Mars will still be there, cold, dusty, and unforgiving, waiting for whoever eventually decides its harsh reality is worth facing anyway.